Afternoon, everybody. I'm Martin Burret. You can find me on Twitter at ICTMagic if you're not put off too much by this webinar. I'm the editor of UKEdMagazine. I'm also one of the elves at UKEdChat. I'm here in conversation with Sue Thompson, who is a senior publisher and cat publisher at GL Assessment here. And we're going to be talking about the lost girls that are often missing from what we see in schools when it comes to literacy and reading. So, without further ado, Sue, good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
We have a report, which is really interesting reading. You can find it online on the GL Assessment website, which is at gl-assessment.co.uk/lost girls. And throughout this session, if you're listening live, we would love to get some questions from you on Twitter, on the hashtag @LostGirls. And the first question is, what did this study tell us?
It told us something quite interesting and something which I think hasn't been focused on before, and that's why we've had a lot of media attention from this report. Just for a little bit of context, we were doing quite a lot of work with schools around hard-to-spot children, so children who perhaps go under the radar. They seem to be doing quite well, but in fact there may be a difficulty there, there may be some issue there, or they may be underachieving and have potential to do much better. And then out of that we thought, how can we look at some of the data that we hold on very large numbers of students and dig down and look at some of the other bits of information that we might be able to pull from that data. So we looked at our new group reading test, which is used very, very widely across the UK and beyond. And then we looked very specifically at 10 and 12-year-olds, and we then started to look at boys and girls. And we know that the issue of boys and literacy is very prominent in the minds of teachers, schools, and indeed educational authors and researchers. There's masses and masses of information out there, but the fact that we through our testing data could identify almost as many girls with low literacy seemed very, very interesting to us, and an issue that frankly there is just nothing out there to guide teachers, to help teachers, to even inform teachers. So we thought this was a piece of information that was really well worth putting out there. And I'm not saying that teachers aren't aware of girls with development needs in literacy, but on the wider view, there's just nothing there to inform and support teachers with girls with literacy difficulties.
Okay.
It seemed an imbalance to us, and we could get that message out there, we could get the information out there in terms of our statistics and what we see as a really representative picture of what's possibly happening across the UK.
You've already touched on this a little bit, mentioning the data and the statistics. How was the data collected?
Well, obviously all of this is anonymous data, but we have a digital testing platform, and that holds a lot of data which we can then access for research purposes. So none of this is, we don't know the school, we don't know the children's details. It's just like a big bank of data. But it meant that we had a very, very large number of students, particularly the 12-year-olds, because the new group reading test is used quite often when children go into secondary school. So it meant we could look at that, and as part of that bank of data, we have demographic information, and something that we always collect is gender. So we know we can make that differentiation. And it was from there that we looked at the test. What does the test tell you on a class level or a school level? And what does it tell us when we expand that to look at boys and girls across these very large numbers?
So listeners can see from the report that the gap between boys and girls in the report wasn't huge. Was that a surprise to you?
It was a surprise. I mean, we know that the gap between, for example, very high attaining girls and low attaining boys is very, very wide. We also know about the impact of aspects like free school meals. We understand those sorts of impacts. Here we were seeing a difference, and there is a gap between girls and boys, but when you start to translate the percentage of girls with particular difficulties across the nation, you've got tens of thousands potentially of girls who have reading difficulties. Now, yes, it's not going to be as many as boys, but again, we come back to the fact that there's a huge amount of emphasis on boys and their literacy problems. We just don't see the same sort of emphasis for girls, and we're just saying, is there a discussion we need to have with our customers, with the education community17 a potential imbalance there? I mean, we're looking, for example, boys, 10-year-old boys, through our test, it has two parts. So if we look at the test as a whole, there would be 15% of boys would be below average, 11% of girls. And then that's not a massive gap if you then scale up those numbers. And we're looking there at boys on average having a gap in their reading age of 41 months and 40 months for girls. So in fact, the gap within those two percentages is pretty similar. And this is an average of 40 months. So some of those girls will be more than 40 months behind. And the issue there is if you've got to 10 and you're up to 4 years behind, you're reading at the level of a 6 or 7-year-old. And that's a massive, massive problem for those children. So I think you start looking at the whole cohort, you look at boys and girls, you then scale those numbers into what does that mean for the UK, but then when you bring it back down and you think about that 10-year-old with a reading age of 6 or 7, somebody who's maybe only a year from going into secondary, that's a massive problem, isn't it, for that individual?
Quite right. It's amazing how this would scale up across the entire UK. A reminder to listeners, we're after your questions as well on the hashtag, which is hashtag #LostGirls on Twitter. Why do you think there has been this historical focus on boys' literacy over girls' literacy? Or maybe not over girls' literacy, there's certainly a focus there.
Well, I think when you're looking at articles and books about boys and literacy, I think the general consensus, and I think this is something that Lorraine Peterson touches on in the report, is that boys and girls present differently when they've got a problem. So this is awful as a mother of a boy. This sounds to me very stereotypical, but you see it over and over again. It's in the research that boys, perhaps, if they're having a difficulty, it will affect their behaviour. Girls will try to do everything they can to mask that difficulty. So they will internalise that problem. They will be reluctant to speak up. It may not affect their behaviour in a negative way, but they may become rather semi-detached. Lorraine suggests that things like not necessarily truancy, but turning up late to a lesson, skipping the odd lesson, because it's very difficult for that girl to be in that lesson. So not perhaps going to the extremes of some behaviours, but actually presenting in a different way to a boy. And I think we have to accept that, because I've been seeing that a lot in the things I've been reading. But what I'm not seeing is much detail about that different behaviour in girls, that internal becoming quiet, becoming a bit semi-detached, sitting at the back, not making eye contact, those sorts of things, and sort of somehow having a way of coping that means they don't come to anyone's attention.
I was going to ask you about that. Do you think there is a underreporting of girls' issues?
I think very possibly, and I think there is. It appears to me that there's an imbalance, and that there's something going on that maybe needs some that balance being put right, if you like. I mean, one of the ways of doing it is obviously through assessment. You might say, I would say that, but actually we've pulled all of this information from our big bank of data, but schools would be able to look at reports that would give them that analysis as well. So they would be able to see if there are particular girls who are having difficulty. In this particular test, it looks at two aspects of reading. So you can look at those two aspects and you can look at them together. That might be some way of, trying to look at is there a particular imbalance within any one cohort.
So do you think that girls' literacy has been neglected by the education community? I can give you the example at during my own teacher training. I remember very well that we had sessions about boys' literacy, and we had sessions about girls' mathematics and STEM in general, and there didn't seem any crossover with that.
Yeah, well, I think it has been neglected. Again, in Lorraine's piece in the report, she talks about initial teacher training having very little now about child development, and that clearly would look at gender differences. There was a piece in the press the other day that said that teachers, when they're looking at two children, a boy and a girl, with exactly the same attainment in mathematics, they mark the girl lower. So is this some kind of preconception that girls are not as good at maths as boys? And then we're flipping that and we're saying, well, actually, boys have more problems with literacy, which is true. Therefore, I need to put more effort into supporting these boys. But actually, there are some girls there who need support as well. Now, I'm not saying they're not getting the support, and the support may be excellent support, but does it need to be slightly different support in the way that we're differentiating for boys? That I can't answer that because we can't find any information about that at all. It would be really interesting to hear from any listeners if they're doing anything different with their girls. That means that those girls with weaker literacy are getting a slightly more tailored approach, and they're tailoring it to the boys, and they're seeing good outcomes. That would be fantastic to see.
And possibly lots of low-hanging fruit if we were to assess this properly and move it forward.
I think so, yes. I think you're right, yes.
So, you briefly talked about what Lorraine has said in the report, and this is the part that really fascinated me as a teacher in my own classroom. I've identified the children who have behaviour issues because of their learning issues, but one aspect really stuck in my mind was the ones who just simply get on with it and put their heads down and are good students, but they still have those problems in the background. Could you maybe?
I think that those are the children, and as I say, that's where we were coming from, the hard to spot children. Now, of course, we are talking to schools that work with us, that use our assessments, and clearly you can have an assessment regime that will go some way to identify those children. But in many instances, and we know this again by data we have for children going into secondary, once that secondary phase has started, then everything becomes much, much more difficult for those children who are not presenting with an urgent problem. And we did some research with the authors of our York assessment of reading for comprehension. They produced, it's an individual diagnostic assessment of reading. And when they worked on the secondary level, they found a number of children who were getting even to, let's say, year 10, who on the assessment had a clear reading difficulty, and they were not on as it was when the SEN register. So there are children that are going through the system and getting, maybe to 14 or 15, and they're reading at a very, very low level, and nobody has picked it up. I mean, I do worry about the sort of cut-off points that we, in a standardised test, you say the average range is 85 to 115, but actually if you think about that, there's a massive difference between somebody at the bottom of that range and the top of that range. And those children at 85 or 86, if the cut-off for support is below 85, those children, let's say between 86 and 92, that is a low average score, and those children, once they're into secondary, may well have difficulty accessing the curriculum.
So even though they score a little bit higher on the test, they still
absolutely, yes.
Could you tell me a little bit about free school meals, the findings behind that report?
Yes, I mean they do. Free school meals, interestingly, have a slightly different impact whether you're a boy or a girl. So when we looked at our 10-year-olds, of those 15% who were below average in both aspects of the new group reading test, 36% of those were on free school meals, with the girls, the 11% who were had a reading age on average of 40 months below their chronological age, 39% of those were on free school meals. So clearly, social deprivation has an impact, but you've still got there 60% plus of children who are not in social deprivation as measured by free school meals, and they are still having difficulty with literacy. So it's only a bit of the story, isn't it?
Absolutely. Obviously, there are lots of different aspects to literacy, and the test comprises of 2 components, I believe.
Yes, yes.
So could you just expand on that?
Okay, so yes, clearly we are here, we're testing reading. The test is in 2 parts. The first part is sentence completion, where the children see a sentence with a word missing, and they have 5 options, and they have to supply that word. And that will be testing, we characterise that as decoding. It is more than decoding. There's some comprehension needed, but most of it is about vocabulary, vocabulary knowledge and a little bit of grammatical knowledge. The second part then has a series of passages, fiction, non-fiction, with 8 or 10 questions attaching to each passage. The passages are relatively short, and each question is tagged as testing a different sort of comprehension, so inference and authorial technique and retrieval. So it's quite a nice contrast. So in our reports, what we do is we highlight a gap between those scores that we think is significant, and we recommend that those highlighted scores are investigated. And we do that across the range. So even if a child has a relatively high score, if there's a gap, that may need some investigation. So it may be that the child is decoding successfully, but their comprehension is significantly weaker. So that's the sort of advice we give in those reports. So that's enabled us to look at this split and then look at the test overall and pull out these figures.
Just a reminder to listeners that we're looking for your questions, whether you're listening live or whether you're listening to the repeat, the recorded version. You can go onto the hashtag #LostGirls on Twitter. Can I just ask you, do you think there is an over-reliance on phonics in the classroom?
Well, I was asked that the other day, actually, and I think it's difficult to know because I'm not in the classroom. I have to, and I've never been in a classroom, actually. But I think what we are seeing is a real improvement in children's phonics skills. So we know that from the government's own test, the phonics check, and I think we're seeing that, for example, when we published our baseline assessment, which is for children at the beginning of reception, we followed it up with a progress test at the end of reception, and initially the children are given an assessment of phoneme awareness, and some of the children struggle with that. They're only 4.5, and deleting phonemes is quite difficult. That can be a marker for difficulty with phonics. But when we got to the progress and the children were doing their letter sounds and their word reading, most of those children had made very good progress, and the levels of knowledge around those letter sounds was very high. So I think this was a test that was exclusively for England. So I think you're seeing that impact of children coming into reception, and within the first 2 or 3 weeks, they're starting their programme of phonics, whatever it may be, and that means that they really have got that sorted for most of them. And I think it's accepted that this method will work for the majority of children. There are some children where it won't work. So children with dyslexia, for example, will find that method of teaching very difficult. So I think we're seeing really, really good work done with phonics. But I know, again, from talking to people, to going to events where research is presented, that comprehension is not moving in the same way. So there are still those very, very difficult issues around comprehension, which relate to children's language development. And we know there's masses of work being done in schools from the minute children come into school around their oral language. All of that's going to feed into comprehension, but the school can only do so much there. We know that the wider environment, a delay when the child comes into school could be as much as 18 months or more. That is very, very hard for a school to make up in terms of, for example, vocabulary knowledge. Mm-hmm. So I think phonics, in a way, we're seeing huge improvements, and that's a good thing. But the aim of reading is to understand what you read, and that, I think, still needs more work.
Very interesting indeed. So obviously we can't address an issue unless we've identified it. So the report is very good at this, but can you just outline what you think and also what the report says about identifying the problems? How can teachers do this better?
Well, I think assessment in its widest sense is the way forward. If you use a standardised assessment, that will allow you to look at your particular group of students in that national context. So it will give you a standard age score. That the data that sits behind the test is all based on representative data, for example, for children across the UK. And that will then give you a benchmark. You may think within your cohort that some children are doing okay, but actually when you put it in that national context, they may well be low-scoring children, and you would need to do something there. But I think, day-to-day assessment, working with children, working with parents as well, very, very important, the role of parents in all of this, and informal assessment. So it's a mix of things, really, and it's the kind of mix of things that we see, again, when we work with some of the schools. For example, I was in Northern Ireland last week, and we had a couple of events, and we had teachers presenting their assessment regimes, and the really successful regimes are a mix of using a standardised assessment that will give you that overview, that will give you some diagnostic information against national averages, but also that teacher assessment that's done on a very, very regular basis. So it's a mix of things, really.
Mm-hmm. Okay, that's very interesting from my own point of view as a teacher. I think that most teachers use things from a variety of different sources.
Absolutely, it's the best way to go.
Yeah.
Yes.
So what strategies can teachers put in place once they've identified those?
Well, this is where we're struggling, because we just couldn't find anything that said, do this with your girls who are needing support in literacy. There's a lot of general information, mm-hmm. and maybe that's enough, mm-hmm. but we're looking at a lot of very tailored recommendations for boys. Mm-hmm. We're not seeing that for girls. Mm-hmm. So I don't have a wand, I'm afraid. I don't have a magic wand to wave over that one.
Mm-hmm. Hopefully some of our listeners...
It would be lovely to hear. We're really keen to follow up this report with hearing from schools, particularly schools that have got their boys and girls all reading at a really good level. That would be fantastic to hear.
Mm. And also if there's looked at any research they've done.
We'd absolutely love to hear that. Yes.
Okay, so we have a poll ongoing at the moment, and just to read out our results so far, it's gone over 23 hours and 36 minutes to go. So please do change the result and make this completely out of date by the time that you listen to this. But the poll was about, do you differentiate your approach when supporting boys and girls with weak literacy skills? And at the moment, the poll is yes on 38%, no for 50%, and 12% for sometimes. So keep that coming in. And if you want to take part in that, you can go onto Twitter on the hashtag LostGirls and find it on there, or you can go onto GL's own Twitter handle, which is GL_assessment. Just one final question, really, and then we'll go over to any questions that have come in. How can listeners get hold of the report?
It's on our website,
mm-hmm.
and they can download it. And I think contacting us, what would be the best way to contact us? By email? Yeah, we'd love to hear by email, which would be interest@gl-assessment.co.uk. And I think especially people who've been taking part in the poll, we know that was it 38% said they differentiated?
Yes.
We would love to know what they're doing and what impact that's having. That would be great to hear that.
And also what strategies are using at different age groups as
yes,
well.
Definitely.
Things are very different from the very youngest girls to the very eldest girls in secondary school. But it's such a fascinating report because even as a teacher who's been teaching for 10 years now, or 10 years in the UK, many years outside the UK, I still found insight into it. And on one of the pages, which I will be told in a moment, there is a really good table of, I think, 10 different steps of things that you can do. Yes, it's on page 7, so tips for supporting children with reading. So obviously this report was specifically designed for girls, but there was also things that you can pull off for boys as well. But again, I thought those were fascinating. And I think lots of this is teachers day-to-day do many of these things, but actually sitting down and seeing it in print is very useful, and just assessing what you're doing in the classroom.
Yes, and looking at those bigger numbers as well, the impact on those individuals. I think it really made us think, and we want to take this further, so we really would like to follow up.
Yeah, I think this is a really exciting possibility because there is so little research, there is so much improvement that could happen from
Absolutely, yes.
So I think this is just a starting point at the moment, and this will hopefully flourish into some more research and certainly some more conversation. So just to recap on where you can find all of the things from the report. So you can go onto GL Assessment's website, which is gl-assessment.co.uk/lostgirls. You can go onto the Twitter and you can look at the hashtag and also GL's own Twitter handle. UKEdChat and myself on ICT Magic have also been tweeting out and retweeting, so have a look there as well. But do have a look at the report. It's completely free online. It's fascinating, even as a teacher who's been teaching for many years. But really, I think the takeaway message is that there is so much that could be done, which may or may not be being done at the moment.
Yeah, great.
So I've been Martin Burret, and I've been talking to Sue Thompson. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.